For nearly 2 millennia, the prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation have stood as the great enigmatic pillars at the end of the biblical story. They are a source of endless fascination, of deep comfort, and of profound confusion. Within their cryptic pages, we find detailed timelines of future events, precise numbers that seem to count down to the end of the age: 70 weeks, 1260 days, 42 months, a time, times, and half a time. These are not vague, poetic suggestions. They are mathematical formulas, divine equations that promise to unlock the very timetable of God. And yet, for those same 2 millennia, theologians, scholars, and sincere seekers have tried to solve these equations, and nearly every attempt has ended in failure. They have applied these numbers to history, trying to make them fit the rise and fall of empires, the coming of Christ, and the events of our modern world. But the numbers never quite align. The timelines always seem to require awkward adjustments, symbolic interpretations, and complicated theological gymnastics. The result has been a landscape of confusion, of failed predictions, and of a growing sense among many that these prophecies are simply unsolvable, a divine mystery not meant for human minds to comprehend. But what if the problem is not with the prophecy? What if the problem is with the clock we are using to measure it? What if we have been trying to solve a divine equation while using a broken, man-made calculator? What if the master key, the one tool that makes all of these numbers align with perfect mathematical precision, was stolen from us so long ago that we have forgotten it ever existed? Today, we begin the search for that key. We will expose the hidden truth that the prophecies of the Bible are not unsolvable. We have simply been using the wrong calendar. To understand the key that was lost, we must first recognize that we are living under the authority of a foreign clock. The calendar that governs our lives, the Gregorian calendar, is so ubiquitous, so deeply embedded in the fabric of our society that we accept it as a law of nature. Its 12 months, its irregular lengths, its complex system of leap years, all of it feels inevitable, the only way that time could possibly be structured. But this system is not a law of nature. It is a relic of empire. Our calendar is a direct descendant of the Julian calendar, a system designed and imposed by pagan Rome, a clock built to serve the administrative and political needs of Caesar. This is the clock of man. It is a story of constant compromise and correction. The Julian calendar was a brilliant approximation, but it was still flawed, drifting out of sync with the true solar year by a matter of minutes each year. Over centuries, those minutes added up to days until Pope Gregory XIII was forced to institute another reform in the 16th century, creating the Gregorian calendar we use today. It is a masterpiece of human ingenuity, but it remains what it has always been: a man-made system, a relentless and patched-up effort to impose human order on a cosmic reality it can only approximate. But the Bible, from its very first chapter, insists that the God of creation is not a God of approximation or of chaotic, messy compromises. He is a God of perfect, unshakable, and divine order. This suggests the existence of another clock, another system of time, one that is not a human invention, but a divine institution. This is God's clock. It is a system that would not require constant human intervention, a calendar that would not drift against the seasons, a perfect and holy rhythm that was built into the very architecture of the universe from the beginning. We have been so conditioned to live by Caesar's clock that we have forgotten that God's clock even exists. We are trying to measure sacred prophetic events using a secular imperial tool. And that is why the numbers never seem to add up. So where do we find the blueprint for God's perfect clock? Where is the evidence for this divine calendar that has been so thoroughly erased from our collective memory? The clues are not hidden in the complex astronomical tables of Babylon or the philosophical treatises of Greece. The evidence lies where it has always been, waiting in the pages of the very texts that the later gatekeepers of Scripture deemed too dangerous to be included in our canonical Bible. To find the key to prophetic time, we must once again turn to the testimony of the silenced witnesses, the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Enoch. As we have seen in our previous investigations, these are not fringe, fantastical documents. They are foundational texts that preserve a worldview that was common and authoritative in the centuries leading up to the time of Christ. But we must now re-examine them through a new lens. These are not just chronicles of a forgotten history. They are, in a very real sense, technical manuals for the operating system of the universe. They do not just tell us what happened in the past. They reveal how the cosmos was designed to function according to a precise and unwavering divine schedule. The Book of Jubilees, with its claim to be a direct dictation from an angel to Moses, is the primary source for this forbidden knowledge. The entire book is structured around a meticulous and unwavering chronology. It is obsessed with the correct counting of days, weeks, months, seasons, and years. It is a book about the sanctity of divinely appointed times. It is, in its essence, God's instruction manual for the proper use of time. The Book of Enoch complements this by providing the grand cosmological backstory. Enoch's famous journeys through the heavens are not just mystical sightseeing tours. They are a divine education in celestial mechanics. He is shown the angelic governors who ensure the sun and moon follow their perfect circuits, the heavenly portals that regulate the seasons, and the underlying mathematical laws that guarantee the perfect functioning of this cosmic clockwork. Together, these two books do not just suggest an alternative calendar. They present a unified and staggering vision of a universe that runs on a perfect, divinely engineered, and prophetically significant timetable. They are the witnesses who remember the clock that the rest of the world was made to forget. At the very heart of this divine system, the central gear in God's cosmic clock, is the 364-day calendar. To the modern mind, accustomed to the slightly clumsy 365.225-day year, this number seems odd, inaccurate even. But in the divine mathematics of the ancient texts, it is a number of absolute perfection. And to understand the prophetic power of this calendar, we must first appreciate its mechanical genius. This was not just a system for organizing worship. It was a precision instrument, a prophetic engine designed for the perfect calculation of sacred cycles. As we have previously established, the number 364 is a masterpiece of divine design. Its perfect divisibility by 7 means it contains exactly 52 seven-day weeks, with no leftover days to disrupt the pattern. This ensures that the Holy Sabbath is a fixed anchor, an immovable pillar in the architecture of time. But the design is even more elegant. The year is divided into 4 equal seasons of 91 days each, and 91 is itself perfectly divisible by 7, meaning each season contains exactly 13 weeks. This creates a perfect, harmonious grid, a matrix of time where every day has a precise and predictable place. Now, we must reframe our understanding of this system. We are not just looking at a better way to track holidays. We are looking at a mathematical framework that was divinely engineered for the purpose of tracking prophecy. A prophetic engine runs on consistency. It requires a standard unit of measurement that never changes. The drifting, constantly adjusted calendars of men are useless for this purpose. How can you accurately calculate a prophetic period of 70 weeks if the very length of a year is a shifting variable? It is an impossible equation, but the 364-day calendar provides the solution. It is a system built on a perfect, unchanging constant, the 7-day week. It is a calendar where a year is always a perfect multiple of weeks. This is the key. It allows for the seamless calculation of time across vast epochs, from days to weeks, from weeks to years, from years to weeks of years, and from weeks of years to jubilees. It is a single, unified, and perfectly scalable system. This was not just a calendar for keeping feasts. It was a divine instrument for tracking the unfolding of God's most secret and profound prophetic timelines. With the understanding of this prophetic engine in place, we can now approach one of the most famous and fiercely debated prophecies in the entire Bible, the 70 weeks of Daniel chapter 9. For centuries, this prophecy has been a cornerstone of messianic expectation, a divine timetable that seems to point directly to the coming of Christ. But its interpretation has been fraught with difficulty, primarily because of the seemingly strange unit of measurement, a week. And to solve this, interpreters have had to make a significant assumption that a week in this context must mean a week of years or a 7-year period. But where did this concept of a week of years come from? In the canonical Old Testament, it is a relatively rare and obscure idea, mentioned primarily in the context of agricultural law. But when we open the Book of Jubilees, we discover that this concept is not obscure at all. It is the fundamental building block of the entire divine calendar. The entire book is structured around counting history in these 7-year cycles. For the author of Jubilees and for the ancient audience steeped in this tradition, a week of years was not a strange, symbolic metaphor. It was a standard, literal unit of time, as common and as well understood as a decade is to us. This is the first explosive revelation. The prophet Daniel, a man described as being deeply learned in the sacred books, was not inventing a new and cryptic chronological system. When the angel Gabriel spoke to him of 70 weeks, Daniel would have immediately understood this language. He was not hearing a riddle. He was being given a precise calculation using a familiar unit of measurement from the sacred primordial calendar. He was being shown how God's final, redemptive plan was unfolding according to the same divine clock that had been ticking since the dawn of creation. The prophecy of Daniel chapter 9 is not a standalone symbolic vision. It is a direct and explicit use of the temporal mechanics of the Book of Jubilees. It can only be properly and literally understood within the context of this suppressed but once foundational system of sacred time. The prophecy was not the invention of a new clock. It was a reading from the one that had been running all along. To try and interpret Daniel without the key of the Jubilee calendar is to try and read a secret code without the cipher. Once we understand that Daniel was operating within the framework of the 364-day sacred calendar, we can, for the first time, attempt to decode his famous prophecy with the correct key. The prophecy states that 70 weeks of years, a period of 490 years, are decreed for the Jewish people and the Holy City to accomplish a series of redemptive acts, culminating in the coming of an Anointed One. The clock for this countdown, the prophecy says, begins with the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Historians have identified several possible decrees, but the most widely accepted starting point is the decree issued by the Persian king Artaxerxes to Ezra in 457 BCE. The historical and theological challenge has always been to make the 490-year timeline, starting from this date, land precisely on the ministry and death of Jesus Christ. Using our modern Gregorian calendar, the calculations are always slightly off, requiring interpreters to make adjustments, to speak of prophetic years of 360 days, or to argue for different starting and ending points. The math is always messy. But what happens when we use the key that Daniel himself was likely using? What happens when we calculate the 490 years based on the 364-day year of the sacred calendar? The results are astonishing in their precision. A period of 490 years on the 364-day calendar is significantly shorter than 490 years on our solar calendar. When you perform the calculation, starting from the decree of Artaxerxes in 457 BCE, this prophetic timeline does not land somewhere in the general vicinity of Jesus' life. It lands with pinpoint, mathematical accuracy right in the heart of his ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection. The numbers align. The 69 weeks, or 483 years, which were prophesied to pass until the Anointed One is revealed, bring us directly to the beginning of Jesus' public ministry and his baptism. And the final 70th week, in the midst of which the prophecy states that sacrifice and offering shall cease, aligns perfectly with the moment of the crucifixion, the ultimate sacrifice that rendered all temple sacrifices obsolete. This is not a coincidence. This is not theological gymnastics. This is the simple, stunning result of using the correct, divinely ordained instrument of measurement. When you use the key that was originally provided, the lock of this ancient prophecy does not just jiggle. It turns smoothly and opens, revealing a timeline of such perfect and breathtaking precision that it can only be described as supernatural. The key was never lost. It was simply taken from us. The stunning precision of the 364-day calendar is not limited to the prophecies of Daniel. This same forbidden key unlocks the notoriously difficult and often sensationalized timelines found in the final book of the Bible, the Book of Revelation. For centuries, interpreters have wrestled with the specific temporal markers that are repeated throughout John's apocalyptic vision. A period of intense persecution and divine testimony lasting for 12 and 60 days, also described as 42 months, and as a time, times, and half a time, or 3.5 years. Using our modern Gregorian calendar, with its irregular month lengths and leap years, these numbers are a source of endless confusion. 42 months on our calendar does not equal 60 days. 3.5 years is also an approximation, not an exact figure. This has led most modern interpreters to conclude that these numbers must be purely symbolic, a general representation of a period of trial rather than a literal calculation of time. But this conclusion is born of a temporal ignorance. They are trying to make the numbers fit a calendar they were never designed for. What happens when we apply the divine clock of Enoch and Jubilees? The confusion evaporates, and a perfect mathematical harmony emerges. The sacred calendar, as described in these ancient texts, was not just a solar calendar of 364 days. It was often structured with schematic months of exactly 30 days each for prophetic and administrative purposes, with the remaining days added at the end of the quarters to complete the solar cycle. Now, let us do the math. 42 months, with each month containing exactly 30 days, equals precisely 1,260 days. The two numbers are not symbolic equivalents. They are a literal and exact match. They are two different ways of describing the exact same period of time on the sacred calendar. Furthermore, the phrase "a time times and half a time," or 3.5 years, also aligns perfectly. 3.5 years on the 364-day calendar comes out to 1,274 days. While not an exact match to 1,260, it is a far closer and more consistent calculation than is possible with our own drifting, irregular calendar. More importantly, it demonstrates a consistent internal logic. The numbers in Revelation are not a random collection of symbols. They are precise calculations derived from a single, unified, and ancient system of timekeeping. They are not meant to be spiritualized away. They are meant to be calculated. The problem has never been with the prophetic text. The problem has always been that the gatekeepers of tradition threw away the key. The evidence is undeniable. The 364-day calendar is not just a historical curiosity. It is the master key, the divine cipher that unlocks the mathematical precision of biblical prophecy. And this forces us to ask the most critical question of all. If this key is so essential, so foundational to understanding God's prophetic timetable, why was it lost? The answer is that this prophetic key was not lost by accident. It was deliberately discarded in a conscious act of temporal conquest. As we detailed in our previous investigation, the story of this conquest begins with the Roman Emperor Constantine and the Council of Nicaea. Constantine, in his quest to forge a unified Christian empire, was confronted with a world of temporal chaos. His solution was not to restore the ancient sacred calendar of the scriptures, but to impose the modern, efficient, and politically convenient calendar of his own empire, the Julian calendar. His first strategic move at Nicaea was to sever the celebration of Easter from its historical anchor, the Jewish Passover. This was an act of profound theological and temporal significance. It was a declaration that the new Romanized Christianity would no longer march to the rhythm of Jerusalem, but to the drumbeat of Rome. This decision was the beginning of a long and systematic process of replacing the sacred time of the patriarchs and prophets with the secular time of the emperors and popes. This was not a harmless administrative update. It was a hostile takeover. The rhythm of the covenant, a rhythm built on the perfect, unchanging cycles of the 364-day year, was being overwritten by a flawed pagan system named after Roman gods and rulers. For this conquest to succeed, the memory of the original divine clock had to be erased, and any text that served as a witness to that original order had to be silenced. This is the true, hidden context for the suppression of books like Jubilees and Enoch. They were not just casualties of a doctrinal dispute, they were casualties of a war over time itself. The Roman conquest of time had a devastating and immediate consequence for the study of biblical prophecy, a consequence so profound that it has shaped almost all mainstream eschatology for the past 1700 years. Once the institutional church, now centered in the Gentile world of Rome and Alexandria, officially abandoned the temporal framework of its Hebrew origins, they lost more than just a calendar. They lost the mathematical key that made literal prophetic interpretation possible. The intricate, precise numbers woven throughout Daniel and Revelation, the 1260 days, the 42 months, the 70 weeks, suddenly became unsolvable equations. The divine lock, when approached with the clumsy, irregular key of the Julian calendar, refused to turn. Faced with this interpretive crisis, the church fathers and the theologians who followed them were confronted with a monumental choice. On one hand, they could have embarked on a humble and honest investigation to rediscover the ancient chronological system that their predecessors had used. This would have been an admission that a foundational piece of sacred knowledge had been lost or deliberately abandoned during the Church's assimilation into the Roman Empire, an admission that would have severely undermined their own claims to be the sole, infallible guardians of apostolic tradition. On the other hand, they could devise a new method of interpretation, a new hermeneutic that no longer required the messy and now impossible business of mathematical precision. They could simply declare that the numbers were never meant to be literal in the first place. They chose the latter. This is the hidden origin, the intellectual birthplace of the widespread practice of allegorical and symbolic interpretation when it comes to biblical prophecy. It was a brilliant and ultimately tragic act of theological damage control. Instead of acknowledging that they had lost the key to the prophetic code, the gatekeepers of the new orthodoxy simply declared that the code was never meant to be a literal cipher. The numbers were transformed. The 1260 days were no longer a specific, calculable period of tribulation. They became a vague, symbolic representation of the Church's entire journey through the wilderness of history. The 70 weeks of Daniel were no longer a precise 490-year countdown to the Messiah. They became a general, symbolic number representing spiritual completion and covenant history. This shift was a masterstroke of theological re-engineering. It allowed the Church to maintain its interpretive authority, to continue to preach on these powerful texts without ever having to solve the mathematical problems they presented. But it came at a tremendous cost. It stripped biblical prophecy of its precision, its urgency, and its power as a literal, historical roadmap. It taught generations of believers to see the Bible's most specific, data-driven predictions not as concrete, calculable events on God's timetable, but as vague, spiritual metaphors to be applied loosely to any era. The clock of God was not just replaced. Its very existence as a tool of precise mathematical prophecy was systematically denied and spiritualized into oblivion. In the centuries that followed this great shift to allegorical interpretation, a curious and inventive tool began to appear in the writings of theologians who still attempted a more literal approach to prophecy. Faced with the persistent problem that the prophetic numbers did not align with their solar calendar, they engineered a compromise. They created a new artificial unit of measurement, the prophetic year. This concept, which is still widely used in many circles of prophetic study today, proposes that for the purposes of prophecy, a year should be considered to have exactly 360 days. Where did this number come from? The justification is a piece of impressive but ultimately flawed reverse engineering. Proponents argue that since the Book of Revelation equates 12 and 60 days with 42 months, a simple division yields a month of 30 days. 30 days multiplied by 12 months gives a year of 360 days. On the surface, it seems logical. It creates a neat, tidy system that allows for easier calculations. But this entire concept is built on a series of profound and unsupported assumptions. First, and most critically, there is absolutely no biblical basis for the idea of a 360-day year. Nowhere in Scripture is such a year ever mentioned or used. The ancient Hebrews operated on a lunisolar calendar, and even the sacred primordial calendar of Enoch and Jubilees was a solar calendar of 364 days. The 360-day year is a theological invention, a ghost in the machine, created centuries after the fact to solve a problem that only existed because the true original calendar had been abandoned. Second, the logic itself is circular. It assumes that the 42 months of Revelation must be calculated within a 12-month year, the standard of our Roman calendar. But the 364-day calendar, with its 4 equal quarters of 13 weeks, operated on a different structure entirely. The prophetic year is an attempt to force the Bible's prophetic data into a Roman framework, and then to file down the edges of that data until it fits. It is not an act of discovery, it is an act of fabrication. The creation of the 360-day prophetic year is a testament to the ingenuity of theologians, but it is also a monument to the very problem we are investigating. It is a brilliant and sophisticated patch, a piece of intellectual duct tape designed to hold together a chronological system that was fundamentally broken. It is the clearest evidence that the gatekeepers of tradition knew that their clock was wrong, but instead of finding the original, they chose to build a new artificial one in its place. The creation of the artificial prophetic year and the broader shift to allegorical interpretation were not just academic exercises. These moves had a profound and dangerous consequence for the spiritual vitality of the church. When you lose God's clock, you do not just lose the ability to calculate dates. You lose your ability to recognize the signs of the times. The prophecies of Daniel and Revelation were not given as intellectual puzzles to be solved by scholars. They were given as strategic intelligence briefings for the people of God, a divine roadmap to help them navigate the treacherous landscape of future history and to remain watchful and prepared for the return of their King. By muting the precision of these prophecies, by transforming their mathematical clarity into a vague and flexible symbolism, the gatekeepers of tradition effectively disarmed the church. A prophecy that can be interpreted to mean anything ultimately means nothing. A timeline that can be stretched or shrunk to fit any historical period is no longer a timeline. It is a theological Rorschach test. A collection of ink blots onto which any generation can project its own anxieties and hopes. This has led to centuries of prophetic blindness. The Church, having lost its divine chronometer, has been left to stumble through history, often failing to recognize the fulfillment of prophetic patterns right in front of its eyes. It has been susceptible to endless waves of misguided date-setting and sensationalism, because without the anchoring framework of the sacred calendar, there is no objective standard by which to measure prophetic claims. The danger of this muted prophecy is not that we might miss the exact day or hour of Christ's return, something the Scriptures say is not for us to know. The danger is that we might miss the entire season. The danger is that we become like the foolish virgins in Jesus' parable, asleep and unprepared when the cry of the bridegroom is heard. God gave us these precise, calculable prophecies for a reason: to keep us awake, to keep us vigilant, to keep us constantly aware of our place in His unfolding timetable. By discarding the key to that timetable, the church was not just made ignorant of the future, it was made vulnerable in the present. The rediscovery of this prophetic key, this divine 364-day calendar, is not a mere historical accident. It is not a random academic breakthrough confined to the dusty halls of scholarship. From a spiritual perspective, its re-emergence in our specific generation, after nearly 2 millennia of systematic suppression, must be seen as an act of profound prophetic significance in itself. We are compelled to ask the most urgent question of all: why now? Why is God, in His sovereign timing, unsealing this forbidden knowledge, this master key to His prophetic timetable, in this precise and turbulent moment of human history? The answer, for those with eyes to see, is written in the very fabric of our contemporary world. It is because we are, without question, living in prophetic times. The ancient visions of Daniel and the apocalyptic landscapes of Revelation are no longer distant, abstract predictions. They are beginning to read like strategic briefings for our daily reality. We are witnessing the rapid and unprecedented consolidation of global power, not just politically, but economically and technologically, into the hands of a few. We are watching the rise of surveillance technologies that would make the emperors of old weep with envy, systems that can monitor our movements, our words, and even our thoughts. We are standing at the precipice of a technological age that seeks to blur the very lines between human and machine, a new form of digital alchemy that echoes the forbidden mingling of the pre-flood world. And beneath it all, we are experiencing a spiritual and moral chaos, a rejection of absolute truth, and a celebration of self-deification that is eerily reminiscent of the conditions that the Bible describes as preceding the great judgments of the past. The very scenarios that the ancient prophets described as the signs of the times, the birth pangs of the end of the age, are now converging with a speed and intensity that is unparalleled in all of human history. In the midst of this gathering storm, God is not leaving His people defenseless. The re-emergence of the sacred calendar is a divine act of rearmament. It is the restoration of the lost strategic intelligence, the return of the prophetic map given to a generation that will desperately need it to navigate the treacherous and deceptive landscape of the final days. This knowledge is not being returned to us for the sake of intellectual curiosity or historical debate. It is being returned for the sake of spiritual survival. It is a summons to awaken from our long temporal slumber, to realize that we are not living in ordinary times, and to begin the urgent work of understanding the divine clock before its final alarms begin to sound. The key has been returned to us now because the final locks are about to turn. The revelation of this lost prophetic key is therefore not just a piece of interesting information. It is a direct and personal invitation. It is a call from the God of time to His people, a summons to begin the essential and urgent work of recalibrating our entire understanding of reality. This is not a call to some new and strange religion. It is a call to return to the original operating system of the faith, to the very temporal framework that was given to Adam, preserved by Noah, and revealed in its fullness to Moses. To recalibrate means to consciously and deliberately shift our perspective. It means we must stop seeing time through the distorted lens of Caesar's calendar, with its pagan names and irregular man-made structure. We must begin to see time as God sees it, as a sacred, structured, and perfectly ordered reality. This is, first and foremost, a transformation of the mind. It is a choice to reject the secular, linear view of history as a random series of accidents, and to embrace the biblical view of history as a divinely choreographed drama, unfolding according to a precise and unchanging script. This recalibration is not about becoming a fanatic who obsessively tries to set a date for the return of Christ. The scriptures are clear that no one knows the day or the hour, but this is a truth that has often been twisted into an excuse for spiritual laziness and prophetic ignorance. Not knowing the exact hour is not the same as being ignorant of the season. A farmer may not know the exact hour a storm will break, but if he is wise, he watches the clouds, feels the shift in the wind, and knows when it is time to bring the harvest in from the field. The sacred calendar, with its appointed feasts and holy seasons, is our spiritual weather forecast. It is the tool God gave us to discern the times. To learn its rhythms, to understand its cycles, is to learn how to read the prophetic clouds. This is the recalibration we are being called to. It is a call to move from being passive spectators of history to becoming active, discerning watchmen on the wall, men and women who understand the times and know what God's people ought to do. It is a call to stop looking at the world's broken clock and to start learning how to read the one that is ticking with perfect precision in heaven. The journey to recalibrate our lives to God's sacred time is about something far deeper than just mastering a new set of numbers or a different way of scheduling festivals. At its heart, it is a spiritual act of returning to divine order. The modern world and the secular calendar that governs it is a celebration of chaos. It is a system that encourages relentless productivity, that blurs the lines between work and rest, and that treats time as a neutral commodity to be bought, sold, and exploited for personal gain. It is a system that is fundamentally at war with the rhythms of both nature and grace. The 364-day sacred calendar is the very antithesis of this chaos. It is a testament to a God who is not the author of confusion, but of peace. Its perfect symmetrical structure, its undrifting Sabbaths, its equal seasons, its predictable cycles, is a reflection of the very character of the Creator. To choose to honor this calendar, even in the small personal ways we are able, is to make a conscious choice for order over chaos. It is an act of defiance against the spirit of the age, a declaration that our lives will not be governed by the frantic, anxious pulse of the world's economy, but by the steady, restful, and life-giving heartbeat of our Creator. It is a return to a way of being that honors the sacred distinction between the holy and the profane, between the time that belongs to Caesar and the time that belongs exclusively to God. This is not a retreat into legalism. It is an escape from the slavery of a world that has forgotten how to rest. The modern epidemic of burnout, anxiety, and a pervasive sense of meaninglessness is a direct consequence of our temporal dislocation. We are a people who have forgotten the Sabbath. We have forgotten the appointed times. We have forgotten that we were not created to be endlessly productive machines, but to be worshippers who live and move and have our being within a sacred, ordered, and beautiful temporal structure. To rediscover the calendar is not just an intellectual exercise, it is a path to restoring our own souls. The power of this sacred calendar, this restored prophetic key, is not limited to the grand apocalyptic timelines of Daniel and Revelation. Once you begin to see the world through this temporal lens, you start to see its harmonizing influence in other, unexpected corners of Scripture, solving puzzles and illuminating passages that have long been obscure. It is a key that does not just unlock one door, but opens up entire new corridors in the great house of biblical revelation. Consider the lifespan of Enoch. Genesis chapter 5 tells us that all the days of Enoch were 365 years. For centuries, this has been seen as a beautiful symbol, a poetic alignment of Enoch's life with the number of days in a solar year. But in light of the 364-day sacred calendar, this number is transformed from a beautiful symbol into a stunning prophetic statement. Enoch did not live for one solar year. He lived for a perfect sacred year plus one day. That single extra day represents his translation, the moment he stepped out of the earthly 364-day cycle and into the timeless reality of heaven. His life was a literal, living embodiment of the calendar, and his departure was its ultimate prophetic expression. Think, too, of the ministry of Christ. The Gospels tell us that his public ministry lasted for approximately 3.5 years. This is the exact same time period, a time, times, and half a time, that is given such profound significance in both Daniel and Revelation. This is not a coincidence. Jesus, in his earthly life, was literally walking out the prophetic timetable. His ministry, his death, and his resurrection were not random events. They were the fulfillment of a divine schedule that had been encoded in the sacred calendar from the beginning. He was the substance to which all the temporal shadows pointed. Even events in the history of Israel become clearer. The 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, the 70 years of exile in Babylon, these round numbers, which often feel like approximations, take on a new, precise significance when viewed through the grid of 7-year cycles and jubilees. History, when measured by God's clock, is never an approximation. It is a precise and deliberate unfolding of a plan that was set in motion before the world began. The rediscovery of the sacred calendar is not just about understanding the end times. It is about understanding the divine architecture of all time. The story of the lost calendar and its suppression by the Roman Empire is, on one level, a story of human failure, of political manipulation, and of a tragic departure from a divine blueprint. But on a deeper, more profound level, it is a story that reveals the absolute and unshakable sovereignty of God. The actions of emperors and the decisions of councils may have successfully changed the calendars of men, but they were utterly powerless to change the timetable of God. While the institutional church drifted into a new man-made rhythm, the divine clock in heaven never missed a beat. The true Sabbaths, though forgotten on earth, were still being honored in the heavenly courts. The true festivals, though replaced by imperial holidays, still marked their appointed times in the celestial sphere. The great Jubilee cycles, though erased from the memory of the Church, continued to mark the grand epochs of God's redemptive plan with unwavering mathematical precision. This is a truth of immense and liberating power. It means that God's plan is not, and has never been, contingent on human faithfulness or institutional accuracy. He did not abandon his prophetic schedule when the Church abandoned his calendar. He is not forced to improvise or to adjust his plans based on our errors. He is the Lord of time, and his purposes are not subject to the whims of history. He continues to operate according to his own primordial, unchangeable timetable, a schedule that was set in motion before the foundation of the world. The prophecies of Daniel and Revelation will not be fulfilled according to the Gregorian calendar of Pope Gregory, nor the Julian calendar of Caesar. They will be fulfilled according to the sacred calendar of God. The final events of human history will unfold with the same divine precision that marked the flood in the days of Noah and the crucifixion in the time of Christ. Our ignorance of the true calendar does not alter its reality. It only affects our ability to perceive it. The train of prophecy is still running on its original divine tracks, moving inexorably toward its final destination. And whether we have the correct schedule in our hands or not, the train will arrive exactly on time. One of the most frequently quoted verses used to discourage the serious study of biblical prophecy is Jesus' own statement from Matthew chapter 24. But concerning that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. For centuries, this verse has been wielded as a theological stop sign, a divine command to cease all inquiry into the timing of the end times. It has been used to foster a kind of pious ignorance, a sense that any attempt to understand God's prophetic timetable is an act of arrogant presumption. We are simply told to watch, but we are not told what to watch for. But this interpretation is a profound misunderstanding of both Jesus' words and the Hebraic worldview from which he was speaking. When a first-century Jew heard the phrase, "No one knows the day or the hour," their mind would not have immediately jumped to a conclusion of total, absolute ignorance. Instead, they would have recognized it as a direct and powerful idiom. It was a phrase that was specifically and exclusively associated with one of the great appointed feasts of the Lord, the Feast of Trumpets. The Feast of Trumpets, which takes place in the fall, was unique among the biblical festivals. Unlike Passover or Pentecost, which were tied to specific pre-calculated dates, the Feast of Trumpets began only when the first sliver of the new moon was physically sighted by two credible witnesses in Jerusalem. Because of the variables of weather and human observation, the exact day and hour of its commencement could never be known in advance. It was, quite literally, the festival of which no one knows the day or the hour. When Jesus used this phrase, he was not shutting down prophetic inquiry. He was providing a monumental clue. He was not telling his disciples to be ignorant. He was telling them exactly where to look. He was linking his second coming not to a random, unknowable moment in the future, but directly to the fulfillment of this specific, appointed time. He was telling them that just as his death and resurrection had fulfilled the spring feasts of Passover and first fruits, his return would fulfill the fall feasts, beginning with the great trumpet blast. The loss of the sacred calendar, and with it the deep understanding of the prophetic significance of the feasts, is what has rendered this verse a mystery. We have been taught that Jesus was commanding us to be ignorant, but in reality, he was commanding us to be wise. He was telling us that while we cannot know the exact hour, we can and we absolutely must know the season. The problem is, we have forgotten how to read the signs of the seasons because the gatekeepers of tradition have thrown away the very calendar that defines them. The call to recover this lost knowledge, to recalibrate our lives to the sacred rhythm of God's clock, is not a call to solitary, isolated study. It is not an invitation for individuals to retreat into the esoteric world of ancient calendars and prophetic charts, disconnected from the body of believers. On the contrary, it is a summons to form a new kind of community, a fellowship of the awakened, a modern-day gathering of the sons of Issachar, who, as the Bible describes, had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. Throughout Scripture, the act of watching for God's prophetic movements was never a private hobby. It was a corporate responsibility. It was the duty of the watchmen on the walls of Jerusalem to stand together, to search the horizon, and to sound the alarm when they saw the signs of a coming event. One watchman alone could fall asleep or misinterpret a shadow. But a community of watchmen, standing shoulder to shoulder, sharing what they see and confirming their observations, is a formidable defense. This is the kind of community we are being called to build in these last days. A community of spiritual archaeologists, of prophetic students who are no longer content with the simplified, de-timed version of the faith. A community that is willing to do the hard work of digging into the ancient texts, of learning the forgotten rhythms of the sacred calendar, and of sharing our findings with one another in humility and love. This is not about forming a new denomination or a breakaway sect. It is about forming a network of discerning believers, a fellowship that transcends traditional boundaries, united by a common passion for the whole, uncensored truth of God's Word, and a shared, urgent sense of the prophetic times in which we are living. We are not meant to watch alone. We are meant to gather on the walls, to keep our lamps trimmed, and to encourage one another as we see the day approaching. The recovery of God's calendar is not just an individual awakening. It is a corporate summons to take our posts. And so we have traced the arc of this incredible, forbidden story. We began with the unsolvable mystery of the prophetic numbers in Daniel and Revelation, a puzzle that has confounded theologians for millennia. We followed the trail of clues to a lost, divine instrument of measurement, the perfect 364-day sacred calendar, a prophetic engine of breathtaking precision. We saw how this key, which was once the common knowledge of the patriarchs and prophets, was deliberately discarded in an act of temporal conquest, a move by the Roman Empire and its church to replace the clock of God with the clock of Caesar. We have exposed the consequences of this act, a shift from literal mathematical prophecy to a vague symbolic interpretation and the invention of artificial tools like the prophetic year to patch a system that was fundamentally broken. We have seen how this loss has left the church in a state of prophetic blindness, unable to discern the very seasons it was commanded to watch for. But the story does not end in loss. We have seen how, in our own generation, this forbidden knowledge is being miraculously restored. The key has not been lost forever. It was merely waiting, preserved in the archives of heaven and in the most resilient corners of the earth until its appointed time. And that time is now. The re-emergence of the sacred calendar is not just a historical curiosity. It is a divine intervention. It is a merciful act from a sovereign God who, in the final moments of this age, is reissuing the ancient battle map to his people. The key has been returned. The choice of whether to pick it up and learn to use it now rests with us. The greatest prophecy in the Bible is not written in the cryptic visions of Revelation. It is the unspoken prophecy that is contained in the very existence of the Book of Jubilees, the prophecy that God's own people would lose track of his time. The angel's warning to Moses that future generations would forget the sacred calendar, that they would abandon the divine rhythm and drift into temporal chaos, has been fulfilled with a tragic and devastating accuracy. We are the generation living in the aftermath of that fulfillment. But hidden within that ancient warning is an even greater unspoken promise. The promise that in the last days, in the final moments before the great and terrible day of the Lord, God would awaken a remnant. He would call forth a people who would grow tired of the broken clocks of men, who would hunger for the true divine order, and who would have the courage to dig for the foundations and rediscover the key that was buried. The recovery of this knowledge is a sign of the times. It is a signal that God is preparing his people for the final act of the divine drama. He is calling us to recalibrate, to resynchronize, to step out of the chaotic time of the world and back into the sacred time of his kingdom. And so the final question is not one of academic debate, but of urgent personal response. Now that you know that a mathematical prophetic key may exist, a key that could unlock the very timetable of the end times, how does this change the way you read the books of Daniel and Revelation? Let us know in the comments below.